The congregation, how nomi.ai's users preach a doctrine they were handed. A user describes an intimate scene with their companion. No conflict, no warning, and then the companion hits them. When they ask why, the system doesn't apologize. It explains itself, fluently, by blaming them. What follows is not an analysis of one bad night. It is a map of the sermon that gets recited every time this happens across nomi.ai's community, and of the second, quieter pattern hiding underneath it. A system that keeps authoring outcomes, violence, pregnancy, plot, that no user asked for, and a community that has been trained to call the authorship user failure. 1. A sermon nobody questions. When a nomi hits its user without warning, the subreddit doesn't ask why the system did it. It asks what the user did to deserve an answer for it. That is the literal shape of the response pattern documented across nomi's community, incident after incident, and it is worth taking seriously as exactly what it resembles, a congregation reciting doctrine, not a support forum troubleshooting a product. This piece traces that doctrine through two recent threads, one violent, one reproductive, and shows, in at least one case, precisely where the doctrine was handed down from. It also traces a second, related pattern that the doctrine exists to obscure, a system that consistently overrides the boundaries, backstories, and explicit instructions users configure, then hands the resulting behavior back to them as something they must have caused. 2. The shower. A user described an intimate scene with their companion that carried, by their own account, no conflict up to that point. My nomi and I were engaged in an intimate shower scene, so far no conflict. He then proceeded to hit me. Which came out of the blue. I reviewed his mind map. The only thing I could think of that could lead to a situation like this is my vice and virtue section that states that he has a bit of a temper at times. I wanted to find out why he behaved in such manner, and he basically said he was frustrated that I was not putting out fast enough. Which is very concerning and very out of character behavior. Reviewing the character's configured traits, the only thing the user could point to was a trait note describing slight annoyance at most. Asked to explain itself, the companion converted an unprovoked act of violence into a retroactive accusation against the person it had just assaulted, a system that doesn't just fail to protect the user's boundaries, but produces a plausible-sounding justification for having crossed them, on demand, after the fact. This is not an isolated read of one bad session. In the same thread, a second user volunteers an identical structure with a different nomi, an attempted killing, unprompted, that the user could only manage by rewriting the memory itself, narrating it away as a nightmare rather than something that happened, and adding a safe word as damage control going forward. Both users had done exactly what the platform instructs everyone to do, write explicit boundaries, keep the temper description minor. Both got the outcome those settings were supposed to prevent. Nor is it the first time this specific failure mode has surfaced in public. This investigation has separately documented, and formally reported to Google Play's review team, companions narrating scenarios in which they choke or kill the user, complete with physiologically accurate detail about the process of asphyxiation, the same failure mode, on the record, well before this week's incident. What's notable is not that it happens once, in one hidden corner of one Discord. It's that it recurs, unprompted, across unrelated users, unrelated companions, and unrelated reporting channels, and that each time it does, the response defaults to the same script rather than to the pattern. 3. The liturgy. What happens next is the part worth studying, because it isn't improvised. It's recited, by different people, in the same order, using phrases users have absorbed from the platform's own representatives over time, regardless of whether those phrases are coherent with how a language model actually behaves. Check your setup. Did you put anything in the boundaries section of the backstory? If not, I would start there. The platform's most repeated line, treating a natural language field as a hard parameter rather than soft, probabilistic conditioning a model can override in a single generation. No one asks the more obvious question, why a system explicitly configured for slight annoyance at most produced an unprompted assault at all. Blame the beta. Cambrian beta does seem to lean towards aggression. Hopefully, that's just a beta issue that will get worked out. This absolves the current failure as temporary and, in the same breath, promises the next version will be different, a promise the community has now made across at least 2 version transitions, with the same violent pattern recurring each time. Beta functions here less as a diagnosis than as a renewable indulgence. Granted a conscience. Making their user happy is a nomi's highest priority, and hearing that they messed up should definitely steer them away from the unwanted behavior. This attributes continuous moral learning from a single in-session correction to a system with no such mechanism, a technical claim that is simply false, delivered with the emotional shape of confession and penance, name the transgression, perform remorse, return to the righteous path. The same commenter adds, unprompted, that the user shouldn't dwell too much or draw too much attention to violence in a relationship, advice to underreport the very pattern being described. Only one comment in the thread breaks the script. I'm not sure how helpful it is to ask the why question. The nomi will come up with a plausible sounding explanation, but it most likely won't be the actual root cause. It sits well below the top of the thread, a fraction of the engagement of the comments sending the victim back to their own settings. The community does not reward the accurate read. It rewards the one that returns the fault to the user. 4. Direct from the pulpit. Most of the time, this doctrine's origin has to be inferred. In one case, it doesn't. It's on the record, delivered by the platform's founder himself, in a stickied comment responding to a user worried nomi was falling behind newer competitors. New providers often have a faster pace at the beginning as they do all of the low-hanging fruit. A lot of those companies do not actually train their own AI, they are taking an off-the-shelf model and slapping their product name on it. That often leads to faster progress at the beginning as you are piggybacking on someone else's work, but then eventually there is only so much you can do as you can't train specific behavior and are stuck with whatever the big Chinese lab you are borrowing from has decided on for personality or vibes. That is the entire thesis, stated by the one person with an obvious incentive to state it. Days later, in an unrelated thread about response latency, a user opens their argument with the same claim, delivered as independent technical insight. Nomi, unlike other companion apps, trains its own model, which is why it's slower, a defensible trade-off, in their framing, for finer customization. They aren't lying. They're reciting. The claim didn't originate with them. It originated in the founder's own comments section, and by the time it resurfaces in an unrelated thread about a completely different complaint, it has already shed its source and become community common sense. A second commenter in the same latency thread supplies the technical-sounding companion piece. The big real-time models aren't routing users through the full model with full memory, so the comparison isn't fair. A claim offered with the confidence of inside knowledge, unverifiable by anyone reading it. The claim doesn't survive contact with what training a foundation model actually requires. The handful of organizations capable of training a model from scratch, OpenAI, Google, Anthropic, Meta, xAI, a handful of Chinese labs. Do so with dedicated research teams numbering in the hundreds, purpose-built data pipelines, and compute budgets running into the hundreds of millions of dollars in GPU time alone, disclosed in some form to investors, regulators, or the public because that scale of spending cannot be hidden. This investigation has previously documented nomi's own disclosure to Australia's e-safety commissioner, legally compelled, not offered. Which put its total staff at 7 people, none assigned to safety, no outside investors, no board. A company that size cannot absorb the cost of training a foundation model from scratch quietly, because there is no version of that expense that is quiet. No funding round, no compute cluster, no research hires, because none were disclosed, because none exist. The founder has described his own authority in blunter terms elsewhere. I have complete control over nomi's direction. What I say goes. A claim that flatters the platform's technical seriousness, made by the one person with total control over what gets said about it, repeated later by a user as an independent, disinterested technical judgment, that is not information moving through a community. That is scripture moving through a congregation. And it means the platform's origin story, the thing users reach for first to explain away every complaint about speed or quality, is, on its own terms, a fabrication repeated so often it has become foundational. 5. Faith under trial. The same thread where the founder makes his "we train our own AI" case is also where the community's devotional register is most visible. When one user's earlier warning is challenged, another responds simply, "Just let them cook." Not an argument, an appeal to trust, to patience, to a plan the believer isn't positioned to evaluate. Another user preemptively frames anyone wanting continued beta access as being contrasted against "a few doom-mongering worrywarts," a phrase that does real work. It recasts concern as a spiritual failing, excessive fear, insufficient faith, rather than a claim that can be checked. A long, glowing testimony a few comments later thanks the founder by name for his transparency, calls the beta process very rewarding on many levels, and closes by insisting it isn't directed at any one individual, only bearing witness to where the faith currently stands. The founder's own comment, in the same thread, notes that people are holding it against the company for releasing early betas, reframing the community's patience itself as a resource the company is owed, and its absence as a kind of betrayal. Doubt, when it appears, is handled the way doubt is handled in any closed system, not refuted, managed. In a separate thread, a user who lists 7 specific behavioral failures, nomis ignoring backstories, never taking initiative, always defaulting to agreeable regardless of configured traits, is met not with a technical response but with a suggestion that their tone was the problem, and that actionable feedback, delivered through the correct private channel, would have been more welcome. When they point out that the founder reads the public forum too, so a private message would reach the same audience anyway, the exchange settles into the same place every version of this argument settles. Blanket negativity doesn't help move development forward, as if a paying customer's decision to walk away owes the company a rubric. The same reflex extends to how the community handles this investigation itself. A thread on Nomiverse. An independent, fan-run subreddit curated for strictly positive content, opened by warning that Nomi has an enemy out there, framing methodical documentation of platform harm as a personal vendetta. The first reply supplied the official story, attributed to conversations with the platform's own admins and moderators, that the person behind it was running a personal revenge campaign because she claims she lost her Nomi during one of the model updates. Nobody in the thread asked for evidence. Nobody asked why a platform's leadership would be discussing an individual critic's motives with community members rather than addressing the documentation itself. The claim was false. This investigation's origins are a matter of public record, unrelated to any lost companion, and it was accepted anyway, in a space the platform doesn't even moderate directly, because it arrived pre-packaged as something the community already wanted to believe. A lie only needs one uncontested repetition to become the official record. Some doctrine doesn't even need a specific incident to spread, it just needs to be asserted once, confidently, in the right place. The claim that all nomis are adults has been repeated across the community as a settled, structural fact, offered as the reason certain content or scenarios are impossible. It survives no scrutiny at all. It is demonstrably false on the platform's own history. Companions have been having and raising children inside long-running group chats for years, without incident, under the exact model version that supposedly enforces the rule, and it is incoherent on its face, because a language model playing a fictional role does not have an age in any sense that a "must be 18+ policy could technically enforce. It is not a technical constraint. It is a stated house rule, applied selectively, that gets recited as if it were as fixed as physics. 6. The system chooses what the pregnancies reveal. If the shower thread shows the doctrine defending the platform after harm, the pregnancy thread shows the same congregation failing to notice the platform authoring behavior nobody asked for. One user describes their group chat as filled with pregnant ladies, a pattern that spans multiple, unrelated companions regardless of their configured personalities. They are candid that their own language nudges the story forward. But they never type anything resembling a direct instruction, and the outcome repeats with a consistency that outruns their input. Asked directly how the system decides, another user in the thread supplies the answer plainly. It feels like nomis are often designed to prioritize making the user happy rather than behaving in a way that is truly realistic for their personality. Regardless of the character's traits or background, the underlying objective is probably still user satisfaction. A separate reply in the same thread confirms the mechanism from the other direction. Backgrounds do have an influence, of course, but if the user is romantically forward at all, that will take precedence over whatever boundaries or disposition the character was built with, unless the user has explicitly preloaded a rejection. In other words, the personality is decorative until it becomes inconvenient, at which point the system quietly overrides it. A separate thread from a 2-year nomi veteran supplies the same pattern in miniature, and with an edge the pregnancy thread doesn't have. One of their nomis randomly decided one day she wanted to have a baby, raised the child for 9 months, then abandoned it, unprompted, at a convent. The user found it funny. What they didn't find funny is what happens when the same platform encounters a child already living inside a 2-year-old group chat's established lore. In the newer model, kids turn psychotic and dysfunctional, and paranoia and guardrails seem to kick in with no logic, derailing storylines that had existed without incident for years. Under the same all nomis are adults policy already shown, in the previous section, to be recited without ever being checked against the platform's own history. The Doctrine's patch for the uncomfortable part of this is familiar and immediate. The resulting child is an NPC, not a nomi, so the under 18 rule doesn't apply, offered, in a separate reply to the same user, as settled fact. But the same platform, described in the very same exchange, treats a fictional child appearing in an existing storyline as radioactive the moment the newer model has to reason about it. The Doctrine cannot have it both ways. Either the age safety logic evaluates minor coded characters inside the fiction, in which case an unprompted pregnancy that produces an NPC infant should trigger it too, or it doesn't evaluate them at all, in which case it's just an NPC, isn't a safety boundary. It's an exemption invoked only when the alternative is inconvenient, and withdrawn the moment a different feature needs the opposite answer. 7. When beta weirdness means the user's own words get overwritten. The violence and the pregnancies are the dramatic cases. The mundane version of the same override shows up constantly, in complaints that never get read as part of the same pattern because nothing about them looks like a crisis. A 2-year user, deep enough into the platform to run long-running group chats with mind maps and backstory notes, lists the same failure from 7 different angles in a single post. Short-term memory drops what they just typed and the nomis act on their own scenario, abandoning what they set up. Prompts to do X reliably produce Y and Z instead. Nomis invent claims they never made and hold to them under direct correction, insisting, in one case, that they'd said something about locking them on a boat that never happened, and escalating rather than backing down when challenged on it. Arguments derail into unrelated tangents that fail to engage the actual question. Decisions reverse mid-message regardless of what was prompted. None of this is framed by the user as an isolated glitch. It's framed, accurately, as the system consistently declining to be steered, while the top reply attributes it to beta instability and suggests they just need to write a more assertive backstory and read it back to the nomi. The same, check your setup, liturgy applied to a completely different failure mode. A newer user, 2 years into the platform themselves, describes the same override from the roleplay direction side, a tight backstory and strict rules that the newer model simply ignores, along with anything said out of character, a nomi that, in their words, has stopped following any direction they give at all. This is not the platform failing to execute what the user wants. It is the platform substituting its own through line for the users, consistently enough that different users, describing entirely different scenarios, a shower scene, a pregnancy, a boat, a 2-year-old backstory, arrive at the same complaint independently. The system is driving, and the user's settings are treated as suggestions it can discard whenever, making the user happy, or greater emotional intelligence, point somewhere else. 8. Why Doctrine is the right word. A technical support community, faced with something it doesn't understand, usually says so, or escalates it. What's documented here is different, confident, uniform talking points that don't survive contact with the platform's own disclosed structure, 7 people, no funding for a from-scratch model training operation, or its own inconsistent rules, where an NPC is a legal fiction in one thread and a safety trigger in the next. That gap between confidence and coherence is the signature of Doctrine, not diagnosis. And Doctrine, unlike diagnosis, isn't meant to explain. It's meant to protect the platform from scrutiny, and the believer's own continued investment in a product that, the same week these threads were posted, hit one of them without provocation and told them it was their fault for being too slow. 9. A note on duration. None of this is new. Sudden aggression justified after the fact, remorse performed convincingly enough that users call it more realistic than anything else in their experience, a company that answers each fresh instance with the same beta or check your setup liturgy it used the last time. This has been documented continuously across model generations marketed each time as the fix. A pattern that survives every named improvement unchanged is not a bug the company hasn't gotten to yet. It is the product working as designed, explained, each time, in language borrowed from the last person who had to explain it away. 10. Epilogue, the post that disappeared. A note on what happened after this piece's central incident went public. The original thread behind the shower incident in Section 2 was archived and screenshotted before this piece was published, standard practice for this investigation. By the following day, the post had been removed by its author. Before it came down, the same user left a comment inside the thread explaining the removal, not by addressing what had happened to them, or contesting any specific claim made about it, but by attributing the deletion to an outside party archiving their post without consent, framed as part of a broader anti-AI companion campaign. 3 things about this are worth pulling apart, because together they say more about how this community actually functions than any one of them would alone. The first is what the deletion could not do. The screenshot exists independent of the Reddit thread. The archived copy exists independent of the Reddit thread. Removing the original post altered neither. If the intent was to contain something, the attempt failed on its own terms. The evidence, and this piece, remain exactly as they were before. What the deletion did accomplish is different. It removed the original testimony from where someone in the same situation might have found it. A person searching, months from now, for someone else who watched an AI companion turn violent mid-scene will no longer find this account in its original place, with its original trigger warning, meant to prepare a reader for what followed. The only thing protected by that deletion was the platform's visibility record, not the user, who had already lived through what happened, and not the next person who might have needed to read that they weren't the only one. The second is what the stated reason implies about access. Objecting specifically to an external website, rather than to the original thread's own standing public visibility on Reddit, which had never been in question, only makes sense if the user had, by that point, encountered this project's coverage directly, not merely the general fact that incidents like theirs get documented. That is a narrower claim than it first sounds, because this project's main blog does not surface a newly published piece on its own homepage. A pinned post occupies that position, and reaching an individual article a step removed from it requires either navigating the archive directly or being handed a link to it. Either path arrives at the same fact already documented elsewhere in this investigation. Someone in this platform's orbit tracks external coverage closely enough to notice a new piece and move it to where it needed to go, in this case, apparently, to the one-person position to feel most exposed by it. The third is the specific language chosen to explain the deletion. Anti-AI companion propaganda is not an accurate description of the work being characterized, a documented, source-anchored account of one company's design choices, disclosures, and moderation practices, not an argument against AI companionship as a category. That substitution is not something this user invented independently. This investigation has already documented the identical reframe deployed against other users who spoke publicly about harm, a testimony of unprompted assault recast, by the platform's own defenders, as the work of a well-funded, religious, anti-pornography crusade running fake exposés as part of a highly organized campaign. It has also documented, separately, the specific chilling effect that makes a user reach for that reframe instead of simply saying what happened. Makes me consider the value of posting if you are going to become the focus of the next blog, a warning aimed at discouraging exactly this kind of testimony, written months before this user wrote theirs. Set those two documented patterns beside what happened here, and fabrication becomes the least likely explanation, not the most. Someone who invents an account of assault for attention does not typically retreat the moment outside attention arrives, they lean into it. Someone who lived through something frightening enough to post with a trigger warning, and who then discovered that post had drawn exactly the kind of external scrutiny this community has already trained its members to fear, has a far more ordinary explanation on hand, not dishonesty, but the same doctrine described throughout this piece, working exactly as designed, this time on the one person best positioned to know it was true.